All right, we got Bob Thurnhoffer from Louisville here for the second time. We didn't quite get to finish up our grilling of him the first time. Um, Today, we're going to get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts pretty quickly. So, just a quick recap. Um, so, Bob was at Loyola, where we didn't have saw a lot of tech, not a lot of facility options, and not great weather as it tends to be in Chicago during track season, especially indoor. Moved to New Mexico where we had no tech, beautiful weather, beautiful facilities, and is now at Louisville where it's kind of it seems like the middle way for both of those ideas. Well, maybe even not middle way for tech, maybe a little more tech, but
Mhm.
um, what we want to do is we want to get coaches in this area who are in the Chicagoland area, maybe even Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, where weather gets a little dicey. Facilities can often be lacking, and just kind of hear how you manage that at Loyola. Both Nico and I are really impressed with what you did. I think most of the world is in the track world. So I think we'd like to hear how did you get to the decisions you made when it came to training without a facility, um,
Mhm.
it might be useful. I went to a practice and saw a lot of things
Right.
that
Yeah.
I ended up stealing because I'm in a similar situation. And had I not seen that from you, I don't know that I would have come to the same conclusions you did. So I think one of the things I want to hear about is how do you figure this stuff out? How do you decide what is going to be on the training menu for any given day when we're lacking a facility?
Yeah.
Big
Yeah.
question.
That's yeah, massive question. Massive question. Well, I think like let me lay out the landscape, at least like kind of explain what we had at Loyola so people can relate or not relate to it.
Perfect.
Um, I would say like predominantly for it's hard to say because like, I was there for 12 years, but like the facility situation was constantly changing year over year. So it wasn't necessarily the same all the time, although the basis was pretty much the same. But there was like a couple years in there that were almost like impossible. Like my last year in 2021, because all the COVID restrictions, like there was twice a week I actually had nowhere to practice. Like I had nowhere to go, and
Right.
so it's just like, it kind of like went through a lot of ebbs and flows, but generally speaking, most of the time, I would estimate 60 to 70% of our practices over the course of a given academic year from September to May, June, were in a hallway. And so that involved basically we used most of the time we used Gentile Arena, which is the basketball area, and it was in the concourse area where they do concessions, which is basically like a octagon. And
Yeah.
it was about 200 meters around the octagon itself. Uh, but we would mostly use like this one straightaway that seemed to kind of give us the most width, I guess you'd say.
Okay.
And that straight away involved me rolling out about maybe 20 to 25 slabs of 10 to 15-meter length pieces of track. They all weighed about 200 pounds roughly. And so, I prop it up, push it on the cart, roll the cart out, unroll the track, shimmy it so it's straight, get the next one, et cetera, et cetera.
Nice.
So it was a really like physically intensive, very laborious process to do pretty much every day, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially as my years went on, more restrictions kept getting handed down by administration, and
I
they
have
hate
a
optics of it.
yeah. I have a question that actually might be a little bit of a logistics one other coaches might be interested in.
Sure.
Uh, Multiple 10 to 15 meter sections of track versus one big one. Would you trade? How would, if I was a coach that I was going to buy like, hey, I got to do rollout track, should I buy multiple short pieces or do you think like one big long one?
That's a good point. For me, we did have two that were pretty darn long, that we were able to use in a different area on campus. There was the year that got ended because of COVID, that 1920 season. We actually got access to the student rec center. So I actually had a straightaway that was longer. It was like maybe about 60 meters wall to wall. So I could get about 45 meters on it. And we
Nice.
had like this one slab of track that was about that long.
Nice.
So we did use it then. But yeah, it kind of depends on what you have access to. For us, we needed the smaller pieces because what I would do, especially in my latter years at Loyola, is I would the first thing I would do is I would set up track all the way around the octagon of Zoom, as we would call it. And I would do that for the distance runners.
Yeah.
So they could do like what I would call intensive tempo. They would like run fast 200s. So like, they did their long run outside in 15-degree weather or whatever. And then they would come in afterwards and they would do some fast 200s around Gentile. And so, I'd get there really early. I would set up the whole octagon of Zoom. And that meant like, yeah, about 4 to 6 uh pieces and in the main straightaway that I would use. And then I'd have to use carpets to fill in the corner of one part of the octagon, and then maybe 3 on the next straightaway, then carpets in the corner, a couple more on the next straightaway, carpets in the corner, maybe a piece of track or two, and then fill out that last straightaway. So I had track all the way around.
Cool.
So for us, it worked better to have like smaller pieces so we could kind of create this octagon of sorts.
Yeah.
But if you just have a long stretch, like if you're working with a 60-meter straightaway hallway, then it would be better to just have a long piece. Because the only issue that I had in the straightaway that I predominantly used throughout my time there is you have like flaps. So like you put a piece of 15-meter down and then
Yeah.
you lay the next one down, and I'd have to put it under, but there it would always be up a little. And I
Gotcha.
didn't want to put this part up because then sometimes a kid would clip it.
Yep.
And then throughout a practice, I would have to like readjust all the mats because like we're doing acceleration, the mat kind of slides back little by little, and then all of a sudden you have a gap of concrete floor there. And so
Okay.
I think like it kind of depends on what you have available. For our functions, the smaller pieces work better so we could accommodate the whole team. But
Yeah.
if I was in a high school setting and I had the massive hallway available to me that was 50, 100 meters long, I would just give me as long as possible. So I can just set it up and I know it's going to be fine. I'm not going to have cracks in there or anything like that.
Cool. Yeah. That's exactly what I was looking for. Awesome. So,
Yeah.
okay, I
Hey,
cut you off.
what?
Sorry.
One sec, one sec.
Yeah.
You set that up because you wanted kids to train in spikes.
Yeah.
Is that the main?
Yeah.
Okay. So if we talk about like in just this whole thing, if we just talk about a high school kid, um, I I want to ask the general question real quick: the necessity of a high school kid to really need to train in spikes. So if you don't have an indoor track, we're very fortunate. We got a gorgeous facility, but a lot of these teams don't.
Right.
Where do you land on the necessity of a high school age kid to really need to train in spikes indoors if you only got hallways and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I would say let me backpedal there a little bit. We would set up the whole track partially for spikes for sure. Yeah, especially for what I was doing, 100% to actually sprint,
Yeah.
fully but the other side of it is if we didn't put track there, it was just a very slick concrete surface.
Mm-hmm.
Uh and so it's sort of like to save the legs of that. Like if distance runners are kind of cruising through 200s on concrete, that's a lot of pounding.
Yeah.
And it's just slick. So you could easily, like, if you're coming through on that octagon, it's not a wide turn, it's a very sharp turn, and you're kind of leaning pretty good. Especially like I cleaned up spilled beer and slices of pizza and soda Often. This is a weekly thing I did.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I was every bit as much a janitor as I was a coach. And so like maybe you miss something, you know, you could miss
Yeah,
there's like a little bit of soda off to, you know, I'm serious. Like
yeah,
it happened to us several times where that happened. And so, you know, you could
That's my
easily
coach's box at school.
yeah.
so
My coach's box. Someone's got to come by and clean up my spilled beer and soda every day.
Yeah.
so so yeah, so I mean, it wasn't just about the spikes. It was a safety concern. It was a health, like keeping the legs at least a little fresher. Like I know after they got rid of me, after Loyola didn't renew my contract, they actually got rid of all that track. They got rid of it entirely because they were phasing out all the speed power events, which now they have. I don't think there's a single speed power athlete anymore.
Hmm.
They were just like they cut some people and then people quit and people transferred and then you know it just kind of reduced year over year. But I know that first year they actually all got rid of it. Like my good friend John DeGrave, who works for Lakeshore Athletic, like the timing company. Yeah, he texted me the one day. He's like, "Look what I'm taking away," and he sent me a pic of all the slabs of track that you know I used to roll out all the time there. And so I know like the remaining speed power athletes that were there that first year I was at New Mexico and the first year I was gone from Loyola, when they would go to Gentile, they would just be on the concrete and they would just do a straightaway and work on the concrete. And so it was a lot of you know, not very good on the shins, you know. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
um but anyways, yeah, to get your to your question there, Nikos, on like does a kid need to train in spikes if they you know if you don't have adequate facilities indoors um and so on. I would highly recommend getting the track surface largely for the reasons I mentioned, for the safety and the health of the athletes, because yeah, it's not, you don't want to be too much on, obviously you don't want to be on concrete too often because that can create a host of issues. But yeah, I don't know if like does a freshman kid really need to be spiking up all the time? Probably not. No, I mean, I think like I think it depends on the development and their age within the sport. Um, but yeah, I mean, especially if you're just starting out like in January. I think when I was in high school, we started in February actually, or like January, February. So I don't know how it works now in Illinois, but yeah, I think you're probably working in flats for a good chunk of the indoor season as kids are just starting track and field, especially if it's their first year and especially if it's their second year. And so I think you're just learning how to move effectively. You're probably learning basic movement concepts like acceleration and posture, dorsiflexion, like very fundamental things that apply to all of track and field. And so I want to think you necessitate spikes for that. Oh, but I do think like eventually you got to spike once they've created at least some understanding and they have some decent training under them. Then, I mean, maybe a couple months in, then you can spike up and practice a little bit more frequently. But
Yeah.
the idea that a kid needs to be spiking up like in their second week of practice, I don't think that's necessary at all. No.
Yeah. Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah, we don't wear spikes often. Only when we're really looking at those max effort all
Right.
out days, the speed development days, and maybe it's once a week where they're wearing spikes. The rest of the time they're in flats, and that you just find that these kids just can't handle the
Yeah.
positions that the spike puts them in, especially
Yeah.
now with these super spikes and all this stuff. Like a pair of
Oh,
$30 spikes is going to be way more beneficial for these kids than the $180 spikes that are putting you in such aggressive positions. We had a girl that, or a few girls that got the Nike Max Flies, and all of a sudden they started getting Achilles tendinopathy.
yeah.
You're like, yeah,
100%.
because you can't handle that.
Well, that's I know we talked about it briefly last time about like, you know, max effort sprinting with undeveloped kids. And I mean, I've even had it often in my in my coaching career, especially at Loyola. I had this a lot where it's just like you get a kid, especially if it's like a walk-on freshman, you know, they can't even like hit a sprint position yet. They're not like capable of like a max speed position. Whether they go max effort or sub max effort, they can't even like quite get to that position yet. And so that's where I think you got to be careful with, like, are you overcooking a stimulus way too soon? Like, you need to take the time to put the ingredients in and cook it and add layers to it before you know, dial it all the way up. And so often with those types of kids, especially at Loyola, like, I would keep them in acceleration longer through the year, and I would keep them doing resisted sprinting for longer throughout the year, just so they could get adequate strength and they could build force application. And then, you know, I might have them stay in resisted sprints for 2 to 3 months longer than I would a junior senior level athlete, because they just haven't learned how to express force or line posture up, you know what I mean? And so that's where I think, like, as you move through coaching, like, you have to make those skillful decisions. And especially the younger a kid is, the more I feel like acceleration is more paramount, and anything upright should probably be more sub maximal and skillful rather than max.
Yeah.
But you definitely have to, there's going to be times where you have to dial that intensity all the way to 8, 9, 10 in a max B, even with a freshman kid. But it's just like, don't do that too soon, you know? Understand that, like, if you don't get to that their freshman year, that's okay. You know, it's not you got 4 years, hopefully, right? I mean, I think you're just trying to get them. I think acceleration is definitely the foundation. And the beauty of acceleration is, if you can get a kid to accelerate extremely well over the course of a year, that's going to eventually propel them into max V. And you can do so much volume of it. And that was, you know, all those questions you sent me the other day, Dave, like, you asked about like concepts I use, and I'm sure we're going to get into this more, like concepts I use at Loyola. And that was like a rule I had, or like a programming philosophy that I had, is like copious amounts of acceleration. Just
Yeah.
like there would be times, I mean, I remember I had this Mackenzie Arnold was a long jumper I had there, and she transferred in like 2018 or something like that. And she was just like a workhorse. Like, she could just train. And we would do she could train so much that actually had to separate her from the other group some days, because she would just be out there for an hour longer than everyone. And it's like, some people would be like, oh man, I got to keep working. Mackenzie's working. I'm like, no, you don't compare yourself. Like, she needs it. You don't need it. You know what I mean? And so, like, there would be days we'd be out there for 2.5 hours, just 20-meter excel, sit for 2 minutes, 20-meter excel, sit for 3 minutes, 20-meter. And it would just on and on and on and on. And you do that over months and months, you know, that just completely transforms the athlete. It transforms the weight room. It transforms their max V. It transforms everything, you know?
Yeah.
So and this is a little bit off topic, but you mentioned the copious amount of accelerations. Randy Huntington in Reengineering Sue he was talking about, he had the same kind of idea, right? Acceleration is how to get top speed, how to get to max velocity. And what he found was that with Sue, he needed to focus on the max V portion. He's like, it doesn't matter if we know how to get to something that we don't know how to do.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the chicken and the egg. It's like getting someone to be a really good accelerator, but if they get into the upright and they don't know the mechanics, like you said, a freshman kid, where's that balance? Where do you find that balance? Is it that within the development of a kid, maybe it's just max velocity is mini hurdles. Let's just call it a simple way to create a stimulus, a constraint that will get you better mechanics, hopefully. So where do you feel that there's that, you know, chicken and the egg? Where's that relationship between understanding acceleration, but needing to know how to run upright mechanics properly to utilize the acceleration?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's why there's no like set answer here.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's where you gotta you have to look at the athlete and the developmental stage of the athlete and their mastery of the skill. And so that's where I think you always start with acceleration naturally, because that's the foundation kind of for everything, because you're building momentum, you're establishing postures, you're establishing pelvic alignment and pushing yourself into an upright position essentially. So that's the bedrock, the foundational thing that, and the beauty of acceleration is pretty safe. And every athlete, whether they run a 9-700 or they're a freshman in high school, will benefit from it. But eventually, yeah, you can't just like, I'm not advocating like, oh, forget max V. Like, yeah, I think we don't, I don't fall in silos. That's not how reality works. And I think like, yeah, often on social media or in coaching circles, like dialogue turns so polarized, when in reality that's not how it is at all. Like when the best coaches that I know aren't like, I'm an acceleration guy, or I'm a max V guy, or I'm a tempo guy, or I'm a
Yeah.
speed guy. Like I've definitely been an advocate of being like a speed-based 400 guy, and I am. But man, we did plenty of tempo at New Mexico and at Loyola when I could do it. Um, it's not like I only did speed. And so I think it's about like assessing the athlete, assessing the situation, and making skillful decisions or informed decisions on what's best for the athlete. Now, I will say, like, yeah, acceleration is the bedrock and that's the foundation. But yeah, you eventually got to progress, right? You can't just stay in 20 to 30 meters the whole year. That's just not enough, right? And that was basically the fundamental issue I had at Loyola, is I was stuck with that. I could not get out of that. I had other than that one year where I could get it in that student rec center, which was the year of COVID, which COVID ended for me. And actually things are going really well. Eric Burns will forever be, though, what could have been for me, because his career ended due to COVID. And I was able to train him in that student rec center where I could get him to 45 meters, and he was jumping over 760 consistently. And I thought he could jump maybe 790 that year, but it ended. But most of my time at Loyola, I had a 35 meters to work with, and so I couldn't get out of that. And that was really why I worked with Alan Peterson, our one of my assistant there, to do some budget gymnastics to get a 1080, because that to me was how by doing assisted, I could actually get past acceleration. That was the only answer I had. But anyways, getting back to your question, go ahead. What's up?
No, just quick to clarify that, because you could get them to accelerate faster using the assisted, so they'll go upright faster. Is that what you meant, or
Yeah.
just the fact that you're okay?
No.
Got it.
Yeah, so like if I have 35 meters to work with, I can do acceleration forever. I'm good there. That box is checked. But if I pull them, I'm kind of bypassing. It's almost like if I do a 35 meter assisted sprint, it's almost like I'm bypassing the first 20 meters, and I'm already at the 30-meter mark from the start. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so that was fundamentally why I got it. Now there's certainly a million other reasons, but I was trying to get away within this hallway. How can I get to absolute speed work? Because I can't do it otherwise. That was the only answer I had.
Yeah.
And so, but anyways, in terms of like acceleration and max V, now I think, yeah, I think it's a lot of it is knowing your athletes, knowing their developmental history, watching them, seeing how they move, seeing if they're ready to start getting more into max V work, because 100% you have to get into that. It's probably more specific than acceleration, right? It's when you think about training, you're thinking about what is specific. You think about specificity, what's going to transfer the most, and max V is going to transfer more. But it can also destroy you if you're not ready for it, right? You can get hurt. You can establish incredibly poor mechanics, which can create compensations and ruin a kid down the road. And so, it can be poisonous in a way too. And so that's where I think you really have to understand biomechanics well. You have to understand the athlete well. You have to understand their development, especially you have to look at the breadth of training exposures that they have and training inputs they've done, and to make that decision. But I think what's one thing I do want to mention about acceleration in max V is there's sort of a simplicity in acceleration in the sense that it's just like about pushing extremely hard, right? Now that's an oversimplification. You can certainly over push and start bounding. That's not what I mean. But I think like generally speaking, it's not that hard to like train or teach uh acceleration mechanics or just acceleration in general, an acceleration session, because you get that you're just pushing really hard and you're building. Every step feels like you're building. It feels really good too. But there's what's hard about max V and why it is more coordination based more than like say strength based or something like that is the sprint evolves from building into like uniformity. And that is a very hard skill to master. Because like you when you think about acceleration, you can think you feel the sense of building. You feel each step is like different than the one before it. But by the time you get to max V, you don't have that building anymore. It's every step should feel kind of identical. And that's a skill to be trained. And that's why I think like the younger an athlete is, the more things like wickets or drilling or sub maximal type work where you can get them front side and feeling uniformity and feeling good posture will pay a lot of dividends down the road. Although it's not as specific, I think that's an appropriate way to handle a skill like that, right? Because when you're trying to learn a skill, the best way to learn it is to slow it down, right? And you can slow it down by adding resistance or just coaching them to decrease the intensity, right? And so that's where I think that's that's how I would do it. That's how I did it at Loyola. That's how I did it at New Mexico. That's how I've done it at Louisville. If I have a less experienced athlete, I'm going to decrease the intensity and do more teaching, and I'm going to use environmental cues to create the movement pattern that I want. And then as they get proficient and they have more training exposure, I'm going to remove some of those training wheels and dial the intensity up, and then creating more specificity that way.
I also feel like acceleration maybe has a few more, you have a bigger bandwidth of patterns and options to accelerate.
Yep.
And at max V, it's kind of like we got to be more precise, and there's a lot across bandwidths. There are way fewer options how to run at maximum velocity safely,
Right.
effectively, and long term.
Yeah.
Where with acceleration, it's like we'll have some like internal rotation, and that's okay.
Yeah.
You know,
Right. I
we'll
see what you're saying. Yeah.
there's a little more, you can develop a few extra strategies because you have like going back to re-engineering Sue, you have shufflers and jumpers out of the blocks.
Sure.
You have
Sure.
guys who
Yeah.
push really hard, guys who are really high frequency, where at maximum V, it's kind of like there
Yeah.
aren't that many
Yeah.
options.
Yeah. There's not a lot of strategies there. It's like you have to have uh postural alignment. You have to strike probably slightly in front of the hips. You can't
Yeah.
spend much time on the ground. The thigh is only going to go to about this far past the spine. It's not here, right?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, the movement strategies are drastically reduced. And the time ground really essentially the ground contact time frames are so tiny.
Yeah.
Whereas like in acceleration, you have more time, so it's a little easier that way. And so
Yeah.
it's like you have to just trust that little tap of the ground.
Yeah.
Even though it's extremely forceful, you just have to trust that that's what it is. Because most kids,
Yeah.
I found most kids want to continue spending extra time on the ground, and so they're applying acceleration mechanics, especially in terms of ground contact time, to max velocity when they're not the same thing, you know?
Do you feel like
So
that's a concept you have to teach? Like I think using the word like trust that tap of the ground, I feel like or personally, I run into athletes who are like, that maybe that's not working hard enough, or I don't feel like I'm doing enough.
Yeah.
I think that's a really challenging concept to instill in an athlete.
It
especially,
definitely is. Yep. Yeah,
yeah,
I think we tend to think in terms, I think especially in America, we tend to think in terms of athletic development being like uh very strength based. And
yeah,
so like we just assume that better means like max force. And a lot of time that is accurate. It's definitely
yeah,
accurate. But you have to understand that like not all elements of human movement can be reduced to that. You know, it's not quite that simple. And a lot of athletic, really level athletic movement has to do with elasticity and coordination more than just brute strength, you know? And
yeah,
that's why I think like kids, they come up with they it's like a football mentality if you want, or just you know a strength mentality even more basically. Is just to get them to understand that like proficiency in human movement isn't just simply about strength, it's about other things too. And max
yeah,
velocity is far more about elasticity and tapping into the stress shortening cycle and just about coordinating the limbs properly and aligning the body than it is about just like raw uh, force application, even though it
yeah,
is a
muscling
component.
through it. Yeah,
Yeah,
Well,
muscling.
that's
Not, yeah, maybe that's it. It's like fascia versus muscle, right? Or you know,
yeah,
however you whatever your term is, essentially.
I find that in the strength conditioning world, having the balance between track and field and strength conditioning, I find that that is the bridge that we miss. As a strength conditioning coach, it's like, all right, the only
Yep.
factor I can track is how much weight I move and how fast I move it, really. So my job is dependent on those attributes. As a track athlete or as a track coach, my job is to get kids to run X distance faster. How they do that, it's or how I get them to do that, or that strategy is that coordination piece, is understanding that component. But if you think about like a constraints led approach in an acceleration in the developmental athlete and even elite athletes, using a constraint of a resisted run, it's not about the force application, but it's about the
Right.
fact that it slows the kid down to
Correct.
coordinate their limbs to be able to do what you're saying.
Correct.
Feel the ground. How are they pushing? Where is your positions? And this is an anecdotal thing, but yesterday we were talking about speed development. It's the first time that in our cross country program we're actually doing legitimate speed development. So we're working on sprint mechanics. We're working on elasticity, understanding what you should be doing and how it should change from your general run in a cross country race to what the kick should feel like. And there should be a noticeable
Right.
change. So we were running mini hurdles yesterday. And the idea that it wasn't about being fast, it wasn't about anything about more than what does the foot feel like when you contact the ground? And
Mhm.
how does that rebound come off? How does your leg cycle? And I shortened the mini hurdle so that they had to actively get their foot up and over, and it wasn't just floating over the hurdles. And that's it. That coordination piece is what we've missed. And as a strength conditioning coach, we're like, let's hammer the weights. Let's get them super. What do we say is powerful, but can we really correlate that because the time is just so different? And
Yep.
then the track athlete that is the no weights guy, we're just gonna sprint all the time.
Right. Yeah.
Need to work
Both
there.
are important. Like
Yeah,
I'm not like I'm a huge advocate of absolute strength. It was one of the bedrocks of my time at Loyola because I knew I could do that, you know, and so I had to maximize that, and I still do that. Like I don't think I would advocate absolute strength work for any track athlete, but I'm just saying the overarching point is exactly what you said, Nikos, is like we tend to only think of athletic development with a strength bias, you know.
yep,
It's like you have strength, you have like coordination, you know, you have elasticity, you have all these other
yeah,
factors that are equally as important, you know what I mean? So I think like absolute strength can definitely help get a kid faster, especially the younger they are. That's like that's the easiest way to get a freshman in high school better is just get their squat max up 50 pounds. Like they're gonna
yeah,
get faster as a result because not because squatting makes you faster directly, but because of the neural adaptations, the motor unit recruitment, it transforms the whole body. It's a global effect, and therefore they will get faster because they're so undertrained. But I think that was the point I was getting at, is like, I think whether you're a strength coach or a track coach or a sport coach in general, you have to understand that adaptation, it can take many different forms. And that's where you have to look at like how a strength bias can affect how you understand coordination. I wrote down an example here about 10 minutes ago, is like, especially I had this at Loyola. I didn't have it too much at New Mexico, but I had it a lot this past year at Louisville, where long jumpers on the team had a strength bias in their long jump takeoff. And so what does that mean exactly is they think long jump, they think I'm going to absolutely obliterate the board. I'm going to lower hard. I'm going to smack the board. I want to see the board bend underneath my foot.
Yeah.
And they're going to spend an eternity on the ground as a result, because they're muscling the takeoff, right? And so that's taking sort of a strength bias to what should be an elastic activity. You see what I'm saying? And so that's where I think like understanding the differences in what human athletic qualities are the basis of particular types of movement is just so paramount in growing and developing into an elite coach. So that's why I had to like rewire kids last year. Like, look, a great long jump takeoff feels like you're not trying. And then like they were like resistant to it. And then they hit a really good one and be like, man, I just feel like I kind of ran off the board. And I'm like, yeah, that's how it's supposed to feel.
Yeah.
But then they're like, but I'm not trying. Like, I need to try harder. Like,
Yeah.
no, you don't
Yeah.
understand. This isn't a volitional thing. It's a coordinative, it's an elastic thing. You're just tapping in to the stretch shortening cycle, into the eccentric capabilities of the human body to perform a jump, rather than you concentrically muscling a jump. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I thought
That
that was, as we were talking, that like example came to mind, because I thought it was such a
Yeah.
perfect dichotomy, if you will,
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
That's one of those big things for us after we run flies, for instance, and some kid pops off a really fast time, and you ask them how did that feel afterwards, and they just said, "Oh, it felt slow." Which
Right.
there is exactly that
Okay.
same thing. They always feel like they just need to do so much work
Yeah.
to be
They need to
fast.
attach the idea that like it's almost like, a fly 10 is only like what, a 40-meter sprint, so it's not a
Yeah.
huge amount of work. It's almost like they want to make it harder.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have to recruit this muscle here. I got to recruit this muscle up here. I got to
Yeah.
recruit this muscle here, just to like feel like I worked hard,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
once again, this is a skillful activity. It's an elastic activity. It's not a muscle activity. It's not an energy system, really. Maybe
Mhm.
tiny, but like that's where you as a coach, you have to like, you're not going to give them a long diatribe like we're doing here, but like you have to help them understand these things as well and guide them through how the human body functions best and how to best execute these things.
Yeah.
I have
That
I have a dangerous question for you, Bob.
Okay.
It's a hard one. Nico, did you have something? I don't want to.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so uh, having seen enough of your like lectures and interviews and on podcasts and stuff, I know this can be a really hairy question.
Oh boy.
But when you're thinking about programming a season, I know for you progression is huge and you kind of work with the end in mind. Um, so you don't necessarily like chunk out mesocycles as like an individual thing. It's all a continuation. But at Loyola, when you were prepping for a season, what were the buckets you felt you had to fill? So what were like, first, what were those buckets? And then maybe how did you distribute filling each bucket, knowing we had certain limitations or there were certain times a year? Is that, I feel like I could probably just step away and you could go with that for an hour or two now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so if I'm a high school coach and I'm like, yeah, I got when I was at Bennett Academy, I had a cafeteria that had maybe 25, 30 meters of marble. Um, and so for me, the question was always, how am I going to train a sprinter? We don't have even rollout track. It's 25, 30 meters. I got kids and I got maybe a set of stairs, but I want to know, like, when you were programming or when you were prepping your season, what were the things that you were thinking of in terms of like, all right, I got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this. Now here are my constraints. So here's the audible I have to call on that.
Yep. Yeah. Big one. Yep. What I'd say is, I think as I grew as a coach and I, went through coaching education and just like experimented and did a bunch of dumb shit and learned from it. Um, Basically the way I would do it, like I am and always have been a huge note taker. And so like, so I, before I write mesos or training phases or even just microcycles, I'm always like notes, notes, notes. And a lot of it is just like me. I think like my personality is like I have to vomit my thoughts out. And I can't do that with many people. So I do it to a Microsoft Word document. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but that helps me kind of process through things. And part of that, what that turned into, especially at Loyola, as I felt like I was like growing as a coach and I was getting better athletes and I was getting bigger performances, what it eventually morphed into, or at least as part of it, is I would think radically about what I prefer to do, what a normal program would be. That so it was like twofold. Is I thought about like what a normal program I felt should be for a 400 javelin thrower, a long jumper, a triple jumper, 100-meter hurdler, whatever it is. And so at least I was still working that muscle of
Yeah.
like thinking about what training should look like in a normal setting. Um, and then I would take that through the funnel, if you will, of the parameters I had,
Yeah.
and then it was really just about uh how close can I get to what I feel like I need to do? What's the most specific I can get and the closest I can get to the stimulus I would prefer to be doing right now. And so really what it comes down to when I only predominantly have about a 35-meter hallway to work with some, I can get out to the outdoor track in Montrose in about like maybe when does the weather realistically break in Chicago? Mid-April?
Yeah.
Maybe you
Yeah.
get a
Yeah.
lucky day. You got some lucky days here and there in late March, early April, but you're probably not consistently outside till mid-April. Then I could do the really specific stuff. I could van kids down to Montrose, which is about 3 miles south of campus. It's a public track.
Yeah. Going there
Meter eight.
Monday.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
um and so I could do that, but the problem is like I hadn't gone through all the proper stages to lead up to what I need to be doing then, that's sort of the issue. And so
Yeah.
I had to like skip over things. And like as soon as I to got to go outside, like we're going to speed endurance now. We don't have a choice, And so basically I guess what it came down to is I just identified how specific I could get within a hallway, and then I just went all in on it. I did the hell out of it. So I knew
Yeah.
I could do acceleration. So when I did neural days, I did deep, deep neural days, like neural days that would absolutely fry the hell out of you, like very deep on the neural stuff. And I would pair it with a lot of things. I would really fill in the practice with a lot of
Could
med ball throwing.
Yeah, can you
What's up?
give some examples? Like
Yeah,
what would a
yeah,
typical
yeah.
day be? Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, I'd have say like for example, we'll just say like a big acceleration day would be we do an acceleration based warm up. We do some standing long jumps to start. I'd probably measure it. We might do some med ball throws in a hallway. And then we do some like acceleration technical work, like maybe some stick excels or some RDL excels or whatever we were working on at that point. And then we'd probably get into a complex of a resisted sprint followed by an unresisted sprint. And so we would get up to 400, 500, maybe up to 600 meters of total acceleration work. When it's broken up into reps of 20 meters or 30 meters, that takes a long time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a lot.
And then we do some plyos afterwards. And we'd probably do some coordination based strength afterwards too. So those practices could take 2.5 to 3 hours, and they would be blown up afterwards. Because I knew I couldn't do this really specific absolute speed. I can't do the speed endurance. I can't really do intensive tempo or extensive tempo. And so my thinking was I got to go all in on the neural training. I called it rocket ship training. I got to go all in on the rocket ship training, and then I had to go all in on the recovery training from that rocket ship
Sure.
training. And so
Yeah.
I just played this like 50-50 balance of neural and general training. If you're familiar with neural general extensive, from like Boo and Dan Papp and the USTF CCCA, I couldn't really do extensive. That just wasn't an option for me. Maybe there's some bits and pieces of extensive type work in terms of like technical work.
Yeah.
But when I went neural, I was the most neural guy in the country.
Yeah.
When I went general, I was the most general guy in the country. I went like
Yeah.
Yeah.
really extremes, super, super extreme. And in the general days were not easy. Like they were very hard because that was my only way to get aerobic type work or even like glycolytic type work in many ways. And so I would do a lot of like scramble circuits with a bike just to minimize pounding. Like I remember I would line the group up in the weight room. Thankfully, Dave Vitale, the strength coach there, he was like really flexible with me because like most strength coaches won't let you just go in the weight room whenever you want. But he understood what I was dealing with, and he was always willing to work with me. And so, I would have a scramble circuit, and I would like write it on a whiteboard, or I just tell the athletes what to do. And they hop on a bike and they be firing away at a bike for probably 45 seconds hard, and then they run over to the other side of the weight room, they do the general strength exercise, run back over to the bike, hit a 45-second hard. And that's how I got really good fitness, glycolytic, aerobic. I filled those gaps that way with very minimal pounding and not being able to do tempo work whatsoever. And then you get a lot of multi-directional type work, backwards, rotational, side to side. And I don't get any pounding on the legs either. And so I didn't have a pool at Loyola. Pool was not an option. I would prefer a pool, but that was
Yeah.
not an option at Loyola. Didn't have it. And so I just did bikes. I did scramble circuits, plate circuits, like general strength with plates, essentially. That was a huge one. Um, I came up with all these mobility routines that we would go through that would take about 90 minutes. I got really deep into RPR. I did all the courses with Holler and Corpus, and we incorporated that a lot. We did a lot of deep breathing and visualization type work, which I still do to this day. I need to do more of it, really. But at
Yeah.
Loyola, a lot of it, because once again, whatever I could do, I did the hell out of it. I
Yeah.
just like accepted this is what I could do, and no one's gonna do it better than we do it. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so I was just went really, really deep on the neural stuff, for basically 0 to 35 meters, and then the surrounding stuff I could do it with throws and plyos and then the weight room stuff, obviously, and then all kinds of methods for restoration, whether it be aerobic low lactic acid type work or maybe extreme glycolytic in some ways, or just like mental uh
Bless you.
restoration type stuff, or mobility type work. I really had, in my view, two buckets, and those are the two buckets I had, and
Yeah.
I just went super hard on it. And then
Yeah.
the other way I looked at it with the neural type stuff, especially being refined or confined to this kind of 35 meters, is like, how much progression can you really get there? like if it's 35 meters, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, so I developed progressions with the 1080 on resisted, and I developed these zones of resistance, and I wrote a Simply Faster article that touches on some of it. I talk about it a lot more in some other podcasts as well.
Yeah.
But
I just listened to that one.
yeah, I created some of those to add another layer of progression within, because I can't extend. I prefer to extend. That's the best way to progress sprinting, really, is
Yeah.
extensification. Not an option for me. And so, I created methods of progression with the 1080 that had to do with hitting a certain target final velocity being the velocity you hit at the end of a sprint,
Yeah.
uh, at various resistances. Like, okay, can I get a guy to hit 9 meters per second at the end of a 30-meter sprint at 4 kg resistance, no fly weight on the 1080? Then can they do it at 5 kg? Okay, they did 5 kg. Okay, let's start back over and go down to 3 kg. Could they hit 9.5 meters per second? And
Yeah.
so that was like, so my progressions were very tiny and very nuanced, if you will, because that's what I had to do. And then
Yeah.
another way I thought of it is like, I called it like concurrent progressions. That's how I thought of it in my mind and in my notes. Is like, okay, I could have acceleration work and I could have the multi jumps I pair with it. And maybe I could keep the acceleration work the same, but then I evolve the multi jumps that I'm pairing with it, and that I saw as a progression as well. And so maybe I'm focusing more on higher ground or longer ground contact time, higher force multi jumps that I'm pairing with it early in the season, and then as the season goes on, I'm doing multi jumps with slightly more volume that are shorter ground contact times that are more specific,
Okay.
right? So that, like, that concurrent sort of, like, you progress one thing while keeping another thing the same was another way I did it. And
Yeah.
so that, I think, you had to, I basically was always just trying to find ways to progress sans extensification, if you
Yeah.
will.
Yeah. That makes sense. Um, so, and this is now a selfish question. So I guess two for them and one for me. Um, so then did that turn your, because I imagine jumping had to be challenging. So did that mean you basically workshopped jumps at meets? Was that like we're like we're not jumping as much in practice if we're in a hallway in terms of a long jump or a triple jump. Um, so when we go to our meet, that's when we're going to do our technical breakdowns and video work and all that stuff. I know you did have that you had an outdoor pit there eventually. Uh,
Eventually, yeah. Yeah.
which,
So yeah, eventually I was able to get an outdoor pit on campus, because we had this like rectangle, it was like a rectangle track, a 2-lane. The straightaways were about 70 meters, and I was able to get a sand pit installed there. I think it was 2018 or 2019. I had it for like 1.5 years essentially.
yeah.
Um, and so basically, like with long jump, for example, and then I'll make a note about triple jump, and then high jump is kind of funny how I did it, but long jump, basically I knew I could be outside until Halloweenish, right? Maybe, I think the day you came, Dave, was November though, wasn't it? Like, I remember
Uh,
it was kind of chilly that day.
it was for sure late October because that was when we still had contiguous weeks for D3.
Okay. Yeah.
And it was prior to me starting my official practices. So I had a couple
Okay.
athletes who came
Okay.
with. So it
Yep.
must have been late October.
So I knew from when we started in September till, call it Halloween time, maybe early November, I could be outside. So we got to long jumping immediately. Like,
Yeah.
this week of practice, we were in a sand pit. Whether it was that pit I had on campus there for that year and a half, or if I just drove him down to Montrose, we got to it right away. Just so I could, like, because I know I'm gonna lose it here soon. And
Gotcha.
So it became very technical in that sense. Like we were focusing on movement and technical mastery early on, and I had to progress the short approach somewhat aggressively, not too aggressively. But then like once I couldn't really go outside anymore, I basically I would still do some takeoff work. Like I would do some drills, I would do some like takeoffs from maybe a four step just to kind of keep that rhythm in there a little bit. But just once again, kind of going to back to the theme of like how specific can I get? I'm gonna do the hell out of that.
Yeah.
Do full approaches. I could do full approaches in 35 meters.
Yeah.
For some guys, it was like the whole 35 meters, right?
That's we're gonna get
Uh,
to the wall.
I could do it. I had the high jump mats up, and I'll tell
Okay.
you what, Eric Burns, God bless that kid. He would hit those mats at like he had to been going 10.5 meters a second, maybe higher than that even sometimes. So he would sell out, man, and
Yeah.
he would. I
There's
hope he
an
doesn't get brain damage like later in life.
I was gonna say there's an Eric Burns shaped
No, literally,
indentation into the
literally.
high jump
Oh,
mat.
literally. I mean, you couldn't imagine how much speed that kid was bringing into and that's how he was jumping so far. Is he had we had done so much approach work and done so much assisted work, and we had like kind of learned to utilize that speed into the approach. But anyways, but that was the point I'm getting at is like once we were inside, we did unbelievable amounts of full approaches, like probably close to 30 full approaches a week, maybe sometimes more than that. Because I couldn't jump into a pit. I just never really liked jumping into high jump mats. It just feels too different to me to the point where it's like, is this gonna create more harm than good? And I knew I had like windows early on to work the actual jump itself.
Yeah.
Uh, and like sometimes I would just be willing to go outside in 25 degrees and do long jump. I would slow the speeds down, but at least I do it.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, mostly when the weather really turned, we just did absurd amounts of full approach work. And we would do all kinds of weight. Like sometimes I'd complex it with the acceleration work. Sometimes I would never complex it with assisted, but I call it segmented work, where you basically like maybe you have two modalities in a session, but they're separate. They're not
Okay.
complex. And so I would do like maybe I'd do all my approaches and then I would do all my assisted, for example. Like we did that a lot. Um, and then I would do variable approaches just to work on their steering, like move their start mark up, move it back, move them all over the place. If we really wanted to work on steering, we could, do I'd put timing gates up on the last five or different parts of the approach or, all kinds of ways of doing it. And so that would be the focus is just like, my thinking was I can't do short approach. I can't jump into sand. I can do full approach. So we are going to do full approach
Nice.
and we're going to do unbelievable amounts of it. And we're going to learn to take huge speeds into the board and just learn how to handle it and get comfortable with it. And so that was the thinking. Yeah.
So were you
So
not concerned?
Eric Burns, the year of COVID, he did not jump in. The only time he jumped into a sand pit from roughly Halloween time till when COVID hit mid-March was at meets. That was it. We did not jump into a sand pit one time.
Sure. Okay.
So were you not concerned with the the takeoff speed and their ability to control that speed at takeoff and still be fast? Like,
Yeah,
so
very
you just
concerned.
kind of like
Lived
all right,
with it.
yeah,
I lived with the chaos of the early meets.
got it.
Yeah, just
How do
live
you
with it.
feel? How do you
Yeah.
feel about early meets in general? So this is on the sprint side of things. Horizontal jumps, it's kind of like, I feel like early meets are expected to be a little bit shaky and rocky until you get into that thing. On the sprint side, would you choose to use those early meets as conditioning, as their ability to get those speed endurance days? Would you ever do that, or was it again that's a risk because they haven't hit those max velocities? Or How do you feel there?
Yeah, yeah, often at Loyola I use early meets to get the speed endurance work in. Yeah, and so, I throw a short sprinter in a 300 often, like almost every year I would do a 300 with short sprinters. Maybe throw them on a 4x4. Maybe load them up and have them do 3 events, and even though they're uh maybe not fully prepared for it. Definitely not fully prepared for it, but that's the only way I can get the stimulus I want. And I don't need them to be peaking in January. I don't need
Yeah,
them to be running PBs in January. If they do, great, but I don't care. It doesn't like I care about the Missouri Valley Conference or, getting to a regional meet or whatever, the end goal is for a specific athlete. And
yeah,
so I think there's a lot of value in kind of one of two things, like yeah, maybe having them run events they don't normally run, or having them do more events than they don't normally do. Or you could go the other way and kind of train through the meet. So like sometimes um if I was kind of like, oh, I don't know if I really want to have Jazz do 3 events at a meet because he has a history of hamstring stuff.
hmm
Uh, Maybe I only have him do 1 or 2 events, but I might get a full session in the Thursday before the meet, like a big acceleration session on Thursday. And then, Friday is probably like a rest or pre-meet type situation, and then compete Saturday. So I kind of did it both of those ways. Yeah.
yeah.
Nice,
So
nice.
if we're looking at your progression, I want to go back to the developmental athlete, the guy that comes in, it's a walk on, um, and look, and let's assume that you have a facility that you can do stuff in.
Okay.
Because I want to ask this more for the high school coaches to be able to see, what does it truly mean to develop an athlete over the course of a 4-year period? Assuming this athlete is engaged, they want to be a track athlete for the next 4 years. Freshman, um, not fully developed physically yet. You are seeing people that most likely are more physically developed.
Yeah,
So
100.
what does that progression look like? What would
Yeah.
that be for someone?
Yeah, if I were to give like a very crude example,
Yeah.
like, don't take this like directly, but like just to kind of give you a framework. If I had a freshman in high school and I had the facilities and everything, and that wasn't really an issue. And say it's their first year track, probably most freshmen it is. Maybe not so much these days, but yeah, I would be working a lot on general strength. I would be doing tons of general strength training, maybe every day almost, whether it be a general strength circuit or bodybuilding circuits or plate
hmm
circuits. I would be doing a lot of that. I would try to make it somewhat lactic and aerobic to build moderate exposure of lactic acid to stimulate growth hormone. I would be doing that all the time. I would be doing tons of acceleration work. And then the max V work to me would be more sub max and skillful. So yeah, you could do lots of drilling. You could do lots of wickets. I just call it form runs, where I just like either 60 or 80 meters on a straightaway, and I just have the athletes do run at, let's say, call it 80, 85%, and I'm actively coaching them on sprint mechanics. And I'm just out there on the straightaway, like, hey, get your right foot up. It's a little plantar flexed, hips forward a little bit more. You're like, if they walk back over to me, your shoulder is and your hips are here. I need it to be here. I want you to feel that, and just working on that. Like I do that with athletes all the time. And so a lot of form running, if you will. Um, a lot of resisted sprinting. I would certainly do that if I had access to sleds in the high school level. Or you could do hills. Hills are great too, definitely.
Yeah.
Hills are probably as effective, if not more, if you have the right grade, I'd say.
hmm
Um, Lots of resisted. I would definitely lift. I don't know if I do like 1 rep max type work. Maybe you would. I don't know. Um, but I probably would get to a point where like the sets of like 4, 5, 6 are kind of as heavy as I go.
Yeah.
Um, but just mostly getting the lifting movements down. But I also want to say, because I think there's a danger in thinking like you have to have perfect mastery of sprint mechanics, or you have to have a perfect squat pattern. You don't have to do that. Like you
Yeah.
have to be proficient. You know what I mean? It's just like at some point you can't be a perfectionist, you know. I think you have to get to a point where you're proficient, and then you can kind of keep pushing the stimulus, you know. And so I don't expect perfection. I think that's a dangerous pitfall. I remember I had this a little sidebar here, but I remember I had a coaching friend of mine. She worked with like a super elite coach. I'm not going to name names or anything, but this coach had her doing 5 meter sprints for like months because her shin angle in relation to her posture wasn't exactly perfect. It's like, I mean, come on, you know, like that's way too extreme, you know. It's
Yeah.
at some point you got to live with a little deficiency, you know what I mean? And so but you know, I think there has to be some proficiency before you know, keep pushing forward, if you will. And so yeah, so I think that's what I do if I was a freshman. The focal points for me would be um just posture, learning to run with decent posture, whether it be through drilling or form running or wickets or whatever your methodology is, or probably all of the above. Tons of acceleration work, resisted work for sure. Uh, General training would be probably the most important thing, just to fill out their body, you know,
Yeah.
put them in a more athletic body.
Yeah.
And that can handle more training down the road. You know, that's essentially what general training is going to do for a kid that's only 14 years old or whatever. Um, Keep it fun, you know, have them, you know, make sure it's not too serious all the time. Keep it lighthearted. Obviously, we talked about that last time, so I'm not gonna bring that up again, but those to me would be the main things. I do think I'd probably be more willing to do more like tempo based work with freshmen. Maybe it's a little bit more extensive tempo, but I would definitely do some intensive tempo. I'm not sure I'd really do a whole lot of, I probably would do zero speed endurance. I don't think I'd do that at all. And true absolute speed type work, like a max effort fly 10, I probably wouldn't do it. I'd be willing to have him do a fly 10. Um, but focusing more on maybe 90% with good posture,
Yeah.
you know, maybe something like that, I think would be really valuable. And maybe I do speed endurance like the last few weeks if I felt like they're progressing well, but it'd probably be in that same mode. Like, hey, I want these two 150s to be 90%, and I never want to see you break posture, whatever, you know, the coaching
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
for
Yeah.
that particular athlete. Maybe it'd be something like that. And then, you know, moving into sophomore year, I think I'd start to put a little bit more emphasis on the weight room, where I might be willing to get much closer to true absolute strength in the reps or like sets of 2 to 3 range, maybe like after a little bit later in the season. I think that would become a priority in my mind, like maybe sophomore year, so long as they're developing well. I would work the intensive tempo a bit more. I think intensive tempo would be good sophomore year. I'm not talking about like death marches. I'm talking about like really hard work, but preserving reasonably good mechanics, you know?
Yeah.
And I don't know what that means. Maybe that means I'm not talking about 12 200s. I'm talking about 4 200s, 6 minute rest at 80%. You know what I mean? Like that to me is great. Yeah, it's tremendous. Um, and maybe you start dipping your toes in something a bit longer, like a 250 or a 300. And I don't care if they're short sprinters or long sprinters either. Like, I think there's a value in being able to handle the 4 through the 1, regardless of what you are.
Yeah.
You know, just as I think uh 400 runner has to be a pretty darn good 60-meter runner. I think a 60-meter runner should be an adequate 400 runner. I think for a whole host of reasons physiologically, but especially for development, even more so for developing a younger athlete. I think that could play a vital role as a supportive quality to handle more training.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so I think sophomore year, I think the weight room would play a bigger role. I'd be willing to push the weight a bit more, get into lower rep schemes in the higher weight. I continue on the same acceleration path, copious amounts of acceleration resisted work. I might be willing to dabble in some max B at that point, maybe not. And then definitely I'd continue on the general training. I think really I would see sophomore year as just like very similar to freshman year, but just a bit more volume overall. With the difference being is I'd be willing to pull the trigger a bit more on intensity in the weight room, and then maybe budgeting more time to intensive tempo.
Yeah.
To me would be the two things that I would be willing to kind of push a bit more in terms of intensity. But I think the overall volume could probably go up. They could probably handle a bit more volume on the acceleration work, a bit more volume on, say, the form running or technical work, maybe more volume on the general work too. And then once I got into junior year, I'm starting to think, maybe I'm starting to think about qualifying for state or making a state final, or I'm thinking about like I need to put some good marks up to get scholarship offers, or like we talked about last time. I think you asked that question, Nikos, about like, what you'd do with an athlete. Would you focus on getting them ready for state or more long-term development? And, it just depends on the goals of the athlete. Like, are they done in high school or are they looking to move on? Um, and so by junior year, they're their body's starting to really mature. They got 2 years of very healthy development from a skillful standpoint, from a general standpoint, from exposure to the weight room, and tons of power development with acceleration. Also, I didn't mention multi throws, but I would be doing med ball, multi throws, shot put throws, all their whole career. There's
Yeah.
huge power and it's huge coordination combined in one with zero injury risk. I mean, that
Yeah.
is like as a game changer right there. It's unbelievably good. And
Yeah.
so that would be
If done with intent.
Yeah.
I have found it so challenging to get some of my lower level female athletes to do those with intent.
Yeah.
And, and it's like you have to put them, and it's difficult. Like I'll put them on the football field and be like, all right, let's see how far you can actually throw this, or how high can it go. And it's very rare to get them to. So challenging to get them to actually put some output out.
Yeah. I mean, the intent has to be there, otherwise it's just a waste of time. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that because that's one of those things that, like, whenever high school coaches ask me about training, I would say, like, man, if I were you, I'd be trying to get 100 multi throws a week. You could do it every day, honestly. I know it's neural in nature, but I just feel like you could do that every day. And it's just like no injury risk. It's coordinative. But yeah, the intent has to be there. And so
Can I ask
go ahead.
let me ask a sidebar question to that, because you made the comment of the multi throws being neural. They're neural in nature. I don't feel like they fatigue the CNS as something that has an elastic component to it.
Right.
So,
Definitely.
so how do you feel with categorizing and neural movements and being okay with, going back to back on certain neural movements than others?
Yeah. I another categorization that I kind of developed. I mean, I didn't make this up, but like I think just I'm certainly not the first person to have this categorization, but especially in terms of multi throws, multi jumps, I would say. I tend to think of even just neural training in general, like, is it more concentric based or more eccentric based?
Yeah.
And so that's often how I would. Now I wouldn't totally do it that way, but that's how I'd often like separate, or like I would call like multi jumps active or reactive.
Yeah.
And the reactive
Okay.
is gonna have more wear and tear on the muscle fibers, right? Whereas the active is just you're already on the ground and you're pushing off the ground, and so there's not like a lot of pounding to it. And so that active makes it less demanding. Like you could do standing long jumps every day probably, I don't think but it is neural, and it's kind of like
Yeah.
a ultra really, right? And so that's why you don't have the stretch shortening cycle is very minimal, or the
Hmm.
usage of SSC is very minimal in it, but I'm still definitely there. But you don't have like the pounding, the responding to the ground from a height that you get with like sprinting and like more aggressive forms of multi jumps. But you
That's
could
usually
add
my
like a hop to a throw, and then it
yeah.
becomes more eccentric. Yep.
Hmm.
That's usually my personal way of categorizing too. Like collision management.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Do we have to manage collisions? If we
Right.
don't, we could probably do it pretty regularly.
Yeah,
So
yeah, 100%. That's exactly how I look at it. So,
yeah.
but yeah, junior year, I would get into absolute strength by junior year. I would be one to, do some true maxes or like lifting days that are like hovering around maxes with some regularity. You're not doing it every lift, but maybe once a week for a training block or two. I would definitely be willing to get into absolute speed at that point. Uh, and do it like for blocks of time where I'm measuring it pretty frequently. I would definitely be willing to do that for like, 2 or 3 mesos of flies or
Yeah.
complete sprints or whatever your form of max V work is. But I wouldn't get away from the sub max like technical work. I'd still like pair it with that. I'd definitely continue on with acceleration, but maybe I budget some of the acceleration volume towards max V work. That's sort of the concession I might make. Or I could just do it where maybe even on a max V day, I still hit a segment of excel work before doing it.
Yeah.
Just keep it in there, if you will. And then I'd definitely be willing to hit speed and like maybe the last 2 mesos of the season, maybe we're hitting speed endurance pretty hard at that point. And maybe I'm dropping the tempo down a bit. I'm still going to hit intensive tempo, especially in the earlier portions of the season. Like, maybe like mid season, we're hitting a lot of absolute speed and intensive tempo. And then for like 2 mesos, and then maybe the last 2 mesos, I'm bringing those together for speed endurance. All the while always keeping acceleration in the program. Like it
Yeah.
never like, totally goes away. And so that'd probably be like the shift that I'd get come junior year. And then, the other thing I didn't mention multi jumps. I would probably only do like in place circuits freshman year. And then maybe sophomore year, I might do in place plus some like rudiment series type stuff, or maybe some low box step jumps or depth drops. So it's not a huge collision. But by junior year, I'd be willing to do some like maybe true depth jumping, maybe depth jumps from some fairly high boxes. And maybe I'm getting into more true bounding type activities instead of like more rudiment series hopping type stuff. And then by sophomore, it's just going to look really specific. Or sorry, by senior year, it's just going to look a lot more specific and a little bit more like what I'm doing, at the collegiate level.
Yeah.
Or probably not with the differences from junior year being probably not too much different, but yeah, I'm probably going through like a more nuanced progression of absolute speed instead of just maybe only hitting fly 10, maybe junior year. Maybe I'm getting in fly 20, I'm getting to fly 30, I'm getting to complete 70-meter sprints. So the progression is a little bit more nuanced, and maybe I'm investing more time into absolute speed. And then maybe I'm going to dabble in some sprint float sprint just to add a coordinative element with the speed as a progression from the absolute speed. And maybe I'm pushing the speed endurance a little bit harder. Maybe I'm willing to do 3 reps of speed endurance instead of 2 that I did junior year, something like that. And then maybe I'm willing to get to more intense multi jumps sooner rather than later, like maybe I did junior year. And so, but I mean, the absolute strength, I would keep that going from junior year to senior year, probably pretty similarly, assuming that they're probably going to keep progressing at that point. And then, yeah, I keep the tempo certainly wouldn't go away. But maybe Whereas junior year, maybe the reps are more, say, we'll just say 200, 100s, 150s, 200s, where it's challenging, but it's not a death march. Maybe by senior year, I'm willing to do some 250s and 300s.
Yeah.
And maybe whereas they did 4x200, junior year was a big intensive tempo session, 5-6 minutes rest or whatever. Maybe that kind of turns into 3x250 at 80%, or rough idea there, but
Yeah.
that's my Spark Notes progression.
The more as you were talking, I'm thinking through, okay, what can I do with, as one coach with 75 athletes? And what you said about the progression of circuits and multi jumps when you were talking about at Loyola, you can keep an acceleration relatively similar for all levels. Everyone's working on, let's say, a 25-meter acceleration, and maybe seniors are working on blocks in that 25, right? And that's their progression. But the multi jumps, if I have a group of 70 athletes and I'm the only one doing it, you could make 3 progressions of multi jumps so easy. And then everyone's working on accelerations, but then you have 3 levels of multi jumps. That's what I think would be a really easy way for a coach with so many athletes to be able to keep that progression, keep athletes all training together from freshmen to seniors, and have when I'm this, I can start doing that, and that gives the athlete more of a development. Yeah, so they see like, oh, okay, when I become a senior, I'll be able to do all that cool stuff, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
I think that's
100%.
that's an awesome thing. I'll probably take and add into the program.
Nice. I'm running low on time, guys. And,
my computer's got probably 15 minutes left.
Okay. I'm gonna hit you with a couple fluff questions, Bob, just for fun.
Let's do it. Yep.
Best book you read this summer?
I've read 5 books this summer. The best one I read was called, let me get the title right. It was actually a case study. You know, I love case studies.
Yes.
On the Swedish discus thrower.
Oh, cool.
Who won gold in Tokyo. Training for Gold by Vestein Hafsteinson. Okay. That was really good. That was a really enjoyable one. I did read the Force 2. I read Force.
Oh,
talking about Dan Cleather.
Yeah.
That was super good. Force 2 was really fun because it was like really sprint focused. It was all about sprint mechanics. So that was a really fun read. I still continue to read philosophy. Actually, I love the TV show The Bear.
Okay.
It's just, it just makes me feel like I'm home again, So,
nice.
But like one of the main characters, she reads Mike Krzyzewski book. And so I picked that up like a year ago, and then I actually got around to reading it this year. Because I feel like I read too much like nerdy exercise science stuff, and sometimes it's good to like read more like leadership type stuff, because it's every bit as important as we talked about last time. So but I think I enjoyed the case study the most. Training for Gold by, I can't pronounce his name, Vestein Hafsteinson.
Perfect. What's the most impactful, because I'm just making an assumption here, what's the most impactful like non-book learning experience you've had this summer? Could be a presentation, a podcast, a video, what was impactful this summer?
Aside from part 1 of our talk.
Yeah, well,
definitely,
I mean,
obviously.
Yeah, to be fair to everybody else.
I think like what, are you referring to like stuff that I was like interviewed in like this, or are you referring to stuff I just went and studied?
That you chose to go study.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say first and foremost, just like me doing my own audit of the season, like writing notes on the season. That was definitely most helpful, because I started to like see some gaps in what I did last year, and I'm working, like I'm already planned ahead to like make adjustments heading into this year. So, really excited about this season. So that for sure is number one.
Yeah.
But yeah, this summer I got away from podcasts entirely. Um, I haven't done any online courses. I focus solely on Altus Connect lectures.
Oh yeah,
uh,
yeah.
and I focus only on Boo and Dan Path.
Okay.
I was just like, you know what, I'm gonna refresh a lot of things. And I just feel like if you're gonna learn from anyone, that's who you're gonna learn from, and
Yeah.
so I just like went hard on listening to Boo and Path lectures on Altus Connect this summer,
Nice.
and I'm continuing to do so right now. Yep.
Cool. I think, and that does bring me back to a point you brought up. And if I was to, if you're a high school coach and you made it this far, um,
Yeah.
when you talked about, yeah, one, congrats. But when you talked about, when you were setting up training, you would write out what would a ideal situation look like, and then
Yep.
how do I funnel it into.
Yep.
That was 100% my methodology. It kind of still is to this day, but I think that was probably the single greatest learning experience I had as a coach
Mhm.
was writing down what I would do. And then when you funnel it into my hallway and this is what I can do, the asking questions of like, oh, well, why did I want to run this workout?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then it became the number of times it turned into, oh, I don't actually, early on, I was young.
Sure.
I only made half the mistakes I make now. So, but when I was younger, it was, why am I running this workout? I only have this hallway. What stimulus am I trying to achieve? And then
Mhm.
coming to the point of like, oh, I probably shouldn't have been doing that workout to begin with. Like that wasn't a great idea.
Yep.
It didn't do what
Yeah,
I
it
thought it
serves
did.
as sort of like yeah, it's like when you think about what you prefer to do and then you funnel it through what you can do, they sort of like bounce off each other. And
Yeah.
like you start to learn even more about what you'd like to do it, and it makes you learn even more about what you can do. And it sort of
Yeah.
like creates this like exponential learning effect. And well, one last note on that, the irony of it, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's not ironic. Maybe it is kind of ironic, but is I went through this process for the better part of over a decade of thinking about what I'd like to do versus what I can do. And then like I always had in the back of my mind that like maybe someday I would get a chance to coach somewhere that had facilities. Even though I had no intention of ever leaving Loyola, I was just too stubborn to do it on my own, I think, even though it was probably one of the best things that happened to me to actually get out of there. Was when I went to New Mexico, all that thing about what I would do got I could do that. It's like I had that experience of like, wow, I was prepared for this moment for like the
Yeah.
last decade. And I remember
Yeah.
like getting to campus, so like this is actually happening. So
Yeah.
it's just kind of cool to like have that experience of like I was preparing for something I didn't realize was going to actually happen, but I was
Yeah.
so prepared for it because of that exercise.
Yeah. I think it's a huge thing that, um, in your, when you talked about vomiting notes, that's literally the advice I have given to multiple coaches who are like, oh, I'm trying to prep my training for next year. I'm like, well, yeah, man, your prep doesn't have to be perfect.
No,
Like,
yeah.
scratch
It's more
out
the
stuff.
exercise than the
Yeah.
product, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like when coaches ask me about my training and what I do, like I'm happy to tell them. I'll email it to you if you want it, but to me it's about the methodology more than it is the activities. And
Yeah.
that's why I think it's more about the process of of thinking about programming and writing it than the actual program itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So those are just a couple huge points that if, coaches are listening, I think to take away from is don't I think the thing that Nico and I harp on the most is the difference between what we should be doing as a coach versus what the culture of coaching or the
Mm,
culture
yep,
of this event says we should do.
yep, yep,
Um,
100%.
and
That's
when
why
you
I think
don't
you
have the
you fall into
facilities.
these like silos of thinking a certain way because you're inundated with like, you have to train this way or you have to think this way. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's all about like, about problem solving with what's in front of you and thinking about the best methods, don't just don't get political and be a Republican or a Democrat or, whatever. Just be a coach, like
Yeah.
Yeah.
for yourself, like try to come up with answers, keep studying and learn what people are saying. That's wonderful, but you have to exercise and make decisions on your own, that's
Yeah.
the
One one of the biggest things, so I did the Altus mentorship and it finished up in June. And one of the
oh, cool.
biggest things that I learned from the whole experience, outside of every technical piece, was the fact, like, you, number one, if you're gonna have a very polarized view, you need to be able to know everything else
Yes.
to be able to prove everyone else wrong.
Yep.
So to have a polarized view, you need to know everything, but
Yeah.
like, quote unquote, everything, but you need to know so much.
Yeah.
And when you look at a guy like Dan Paff, one of the things that blew me away was, even through this process where we are all learning from him, he finished with our final projects. He was taking pieces of people's final projects and analyzing his own
Yeah.
methodologies
Right. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
okay, I can learn from these people as well. And it was just such an interesting thing to think about as a coach, you as a novice coach especially, and you have to, so just learn everything. And if you have that, you have to be able to prove yourself right and yourself wrong
Yeah.
if you want to have an opinion.
It's great.
Yeah.
Tremendous point. Yeah, no, I agree. I think you can learn from like just about anywhere. You can always, like, I continue to learn from the athletes every year, like I'm always asking for their feedback, and sometimes I'll hear them say something and I'll be like, man, I didn't think of that before. That's actually a great point. And that kind of
Mm-hmm.
spawns me on another path, And
Yeah.
so it's like, I think always having that the posture of a learner at all times is such a healthy way to be, And so that's where I think it's easy to get lost with that if you're like a bit inexperienced as a coach, and then you got like everyone beating their chest over certain things, but it's like, yeah, there's no one way. It's just like you just have to keep discovering and trying, experimenting, learning, and just, coach the athlete in front of you and try to make the best decisions you can. And if you don't, learn from it, and that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
Drop your mic, Bob.
Exactly.
You did.
That's a great that's a great thing to end on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is awesome, Bob. I'm pumped to see what you guys do this year. I
Yeah,
think,
same with you guys. Yeah.
yeah, it's gonna be an interesting year for sure. So I would love it if we could catch back up at some point. I was telling Nico, since I know you, and now I know you're lecturing at USTF CCCA.
Yeah. Yep.
So I'm gonna corner you, and maybe we can do a live
Oh, that'd be
podcast.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
We,
That'd be super cool.
Mike Cunningham, he's got to get involved.
Yeah, man.
So,
Yep.
but yeah,
That'd be
I
awesome.
would love to catch
Circle.
back up. And one of the ideas Nico and I are batting around right now is kind of exposing ourselves to, like, what did we do? What did we plan?
Hmm.
And then referring back to it and saying what actually happened, what worked and what didn't. And so that's one
Hmm.
of the things that we're thinking about exposing on our podcast, of like showing, here's our nuts and bolts at every day for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And then coming back 3 weeks later and saying, like, well, how many things did I get wrong? So
Yeah. I
Yeah.
love that. That's such a good
yeah.
idea.
So
Love that.
would love to catch up with you again. Always, and whenever you're in town, always want to catch up with
Absolutely.
you.
Yeah. No, great chatting again, fellas. Yeah, I love what you're doing here. I think it's great for Chicagoland, and yeah, glad to be a part of it.
Cool. Awesome. All
All
right.
right, guys.
Good,
Have a
Nico.
great night. Great
Yep,
day.
you too.
Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. You guys have